Did you guys have good weeks since the last time we were together?
Yeah. Yeah. Busy. Midterms in the high school. So
That's always exciting.
yeah, they're
Not really.
excited. They love it. They love it.
Yeah, I'm certain they do.
Hmm.
That was pretty good. For like midterms, not for high school, but for me, was out this week.
Well, good. When's the mid semester for us? Is it the end of the month or is it the beginning of March? I think it's the beginning of March because finals is the last weekend of April. Is that right?
I think so. I just have like a couple classes that we're like starting on them this last week, and so the stress is already starting to build up. That's okay.
Well, for midterms for this class, we're just everything that's turned in, I get graded, and that's what's submitted as your midterm. So, I mean, so much stress is avoided. I hate tests. I hate grading tests. I hate everything to do with. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Let's see. What's a better way to frame it? I find that tests are remarkably inadequate at gauging the practical and functional level of a person's usable knowledge base. How's that? Does that sound good? And I've heard for the last several years that I've been doing this, I moved away from quizzes and tests to do projects. Several people have told me that the projects are a little bit more difficult than quizzes and tests, but they at the end of the class they realize they've learned an awful lot more by being able to focus in on things that they actually wanted to. And that's I think that my principal goal at the end of each of the art history classes I teach is that people have a solid understanding of the framework for critical thinking that I propose, and people are able to articulate how much context has to do with our appreciation for what people create. I think so. It's not really one thing. It's those two things together. Like last week, the first time I taught about cubism at Utah Tech, um, they had several faculty in the class, and they had absolutely no idea of all the connections that were brought in. A lot of people look at cubism and they think it's ugly, and for many people's taste, that's completely appropriate. But once we are able to examine how the participants articulated what they did, I think we gain at the very least a much greater amount of or much greater level of respect for the process and the thinking behind it. At least I hope so. I don't know. Have you guys ever read Roald Dahl's? No, it's not Roald Dahl. Who did it? The Phantom Tollbooth. Do you remember that book?
Yeah,
Kelly,
I read it. I don't. Is it Roald Dahl?
I don't think so. I think it's somebody else, but I read it at the same time. Not James Thurber. No, but it was in
Oh,
that group of writers: James Thurber, Roald Dahl, and the Phantom Tollbooth, and
Norton Juster.
Norton. Just okay. I that was one of my favorite books growing up, and there's a phrase where all these people swim through the sea of knowledge, and the tumblebug emerges bone dry. And I've always loved that image because if you manage to swim through the sea of knowledge and emerge completely dry, that's likely to be your fault. I just thought that was hilarious. Yeah, he was the perfect example of what today we call privilege.
Well, yeah.
Well,
I Oh, I was gonna say I asked my kids today in my art history class. I said, why are we going over analysis? Why do I care? And they're like, I'm like, okay, let me rephrase. Why do why do you need to know how to critically think? And they're like, okay, well, at least you're thinking about why you need to know how to think. Like, So there's some work coming your way. Just giving you that heads up.
That's it's interesting to me because the world leaders that I really admire,
Mhm.
People like the fourth Aga Khan, who just died today, which is really sad.
Mm.
He is the I'm not going to say powerful. That gives the wrong connotation. He is the most impactful world leader that doesn't have a nation. The Ismailis were kicked out of Idi Amin's land and found a home for the most part in Canada, and are pretty much a people, a nation without a country. And the fourth Aga Khan, when he was your age, Sarah, he was already an Olympic skiing champion and had made his bones with, had already become wealthy in his own right as essentially a self-made millionaire. But what's interesting is that he used his wealth to provide scholarships and build hospitals and build schools and develop a framework for medical insurance that's built on a pay it forward model. They created the Aga Khan network, which goes around in areas like old Soviet protectorates and desperate, economically desperate African nations, takes what are essentially dumps and turns them into, cleans them up, turns them into parks. Two of his successes were there was a neighborhood in Egypt, in Cairo, that 300 years ago was famous internationally for leatherworking. I mean, they had the best international renown for custom leather. Everything from dyed ostrich to crocodile and everything in between. But in the last 50 years, it became a complete cesspool of drug abuse and gang activity. And if you saw pictures of it like 10 years ago, you'd see unattended trash 12 to 15 feet high in the alleyways. And the Aga Khan Development Network went in, started by making sure everybody had plenty to eat and clean clothing, access to clean water and medical supplies, access to education, and cleaned out all the trash. And now they are again one of the top boutique leather crafter neighborhoods in the whole world. Completely cleaned it out. And outside of Cairo, there was a famous dump that was compared to, when in the New Testament, when Jesus was on the hill and he compared the dump outside of Jerusalem to hell. I think the dump was at a site called Gehenna, I believe, and it had been burning continuously for over 240 years. There was a dump just like that southeast of Cairo, and it was just terrible. And Aga Khan Development Network went in, cleaned it up, was able to do everything according to international waste disposal standards, and turned it into what is now a national park in Egypt. Completely clean, and it just stuff like that is just fascinating to me. But and he would go and build Ismaili hospitals and have prepare scholarships for people to go through nursing and doctoring programs. And but it would be open to everybody who is qualified, not just fellow Ismailis, which I think is pretty remarkable. Anyway, and he single-handedly is responsible for a renaissance of worldwide Islamic architecture through the Aga Khan Islamic Aga Khan Architecture Award. So stuff tough to find out. I mean, if I die when I'm a young 88, I hope to have half the legacy that he did. And what's really fascinating about me too, or about him too, is even though he was the steward of an awful lot of wealth, as the head of state, he didn't even consider the Tutsi war to be his own. They belonged to his people, which, Idi Amin said something very similar to that. And he was talking out of his ear. The difference is that the Aga Khan actually lived that way, which I think is amazing. The presents that he and his family would get are in the Toronto Aga Khan Museum of Art to show the world, what kinds of, so they're there for everybody to enjoy, not just his family, which I think is kind of cool. Difference between Fabergé's what's the word? Fabergé's clients and the Aga Khan's family. Anyway, blah blah blah. Nobody cares, but it is important.
No, it's good to know. Is it rude that I'm gonna eat my dinner while we're watching this?
Well, Sarah did tell me about 15 minutes before we started that she thought it was just unforgivable
Terribly.
if somebody
Yeah.
ate snacks during the video. So I
Yeah.
would talk to her.
Sarah, you want me to go off camera? I mean, I can nod if you want, like whatever you need.
No, I think you're actually fine. I'll get over.
Okay. The worst part is that my dinner is
Annoyance I
cake and
have.
ice cream. So there you go.
Oh,
heck
how
yeah.
miserable for you.
I'm a
But
child.
that has
Milk.
that has protein. It
Mhm.
has wheat. It has everything for the basic food group. So
Yeah.
go for it.
Thank you. But I'm here.
Well, this week I wanted to iterate a couple things about the projects and the weekly reflections. I have been going through and grading things. There's a couple things that I want people to remember. One is, well, several. One is whatever you turn in, regardless of whatever the score is, if it's 0 or what, look at the comment and either ask me for clarification or make the change and resubmit. There's been like a couple of projects were turned in that didn't have anything identifying them as being part or related to the scope of the class. And that can be easily solved by an initial paragraph where you say, this relates to the class because, even though I'm tracing the history of stone tools, this has to do with the class because of the work in the 1980s of people bringing back the art of knapping or obsidian chipping. And you can make an argument for that, but if it needs to be clarified or if it needs to be in a format that my computer recognizes or whatever, before you freak out when you see a 0, look at what I've said and then resubmit. Another thing is people will miss points if you do a video weekly reflection, it needs to be at least 3 minutes. If you do a written reflection, it needs to be at least 300 words. And again, I've said this a couple times at the beginning of the semester, that does not include the words in your title, and it does not include your citation words. Okay? I've had people turn in like 307 word essays when 9 of those words are from the citation. And that's not, just add another sentence. And you can always add a sentence in the analysis or the evaluation. You can make something up. Just imagine you're trying to explain this to a roommate or a family member, and you can usually come up with a few more words. Then all you have to do is resubmit it. It's not that big of a deal. Now, I will, if people do submit the video reflections and they're 3 minutes and 2 seconds, and you have 40 seconds of instrumental music setting the tone at the beginning, that isn't going to count either. Okay, so does everybody understand that? I'm hoping. Okay.
I just need to know if any of these kids were my students at Pineview.
I don't know. That'd be interesting. Thankfully, not very many people have submitted the lengthy introduction music. What is wonderful is, with all the license-free music snippets that you can get for free online, the opportunities for doing that are boundless. And I just hope nobody does it. Please don't. And again, as always, make sure that everything is in MLA format, your citations, and they are alphabetically arranged. Even if your annotated bibliography needs to be in a specific order, for the purposes of this assignment, everything has to be, all the citations have to be alphabetical. And if you really feel that it needs to be in a different order than that, you can number them in order, and then at the end say, here are the citations in alphabetical order, and do the citations underneath. But I really don't think that that's going to be necessary almost all the time. This week we're talking a little bit about futurism, which I think is one of the more disheartening 20th century art movements, just because it's based on hatred, or at least it's very powerfully energized by hatred. And I like what Michael J. Fox, about 2 years ago, Michael J. Fox gave an interview, and he said anger and hatred are non-sustainable. And you talked to John Cleese talked about why Monty Python ended, is because they woke up one morning and there was nothing else to be angry about. They worked all the mad out, and now they just work on the humor and parody the absurd and make fun of things instead of expressing their anger. And so they're still going strong, which I think is really interesting to see that. There is always going to be a place for sarcasm. I'm not discounting sarcasm. I think sarcasm is one of the truest signs of an enlightened mind. But when everything done is motivated by hatred or anger towards something specific, sooner or later, either it runs out of steam or there's the platform is gone. There's nothing else there. And it's fascinating to me. I say that in regards specifically to art, because creation is about building. And there are artists that a very powerful element of art is societal critique. I talked to you guys about Wassily Kandinsky, didn't I? The two-pronged artist is prophet. And both of those are, self-critique of a society, and then also prescience for, what will happen if you continue. Both of those things are equally vital. But when artists, by their nature, are committed to create, it's difficult to do that on a platform of destruction. So something to be considering about. It's fascinating to me that when enough resources are put in, channels can be continued for quite a while. But if you look at it in retrospect, you see that the steam has disappeared. And I'm speaking specifically about the art Mao Zedong was really pushing on the Chinese people. He said that art had no place outside of propaganda. And what's fascinating to me is that you can see that. In retrospect, we can go back and look at the artwork that was inspired by him, and you can see that it really, I don't know, it felt like it was plotting. And as people were able to claim some sort of hope to go forward on, then they were able to do a lot more things. You look at, and just as a for instance, I'm thinking of Jackie Chan and his production company. The moment that he started doing stuff specifically designed to entertain families, his career skyrocketed. And he influenced every single action star that you can think of in the Western world is inspired heavily by Jackie Chan for very similar reasons. And I just think that that's really fascinating. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to share this. We're going to watch a couple of videos, and I warn people ahead of time, if YouTube makes me censor them out, just go and watch them in the module where they show up. So what we're looking at here is an example of futurism. And right here, this reminds me very much of some of those Cubist artworks that we looked at. What's fascinating to me is that it's really hard a lot of the times to tell what the difference is between futurism and cubism unless you understand or appreciate what the manifesto was that they did, and you look at it really, really closely next to other Cubist work. And I wanted to, I thought that this was a really good example. This set kind of sets the stage for the Futurist Manifesto. And I wanted to, this is from MontyPython, and I wanted to share this with you. I think it's great, but it really helps to set the stage. I think you get the idea of what I'm talking about here. You know, this is a play on the riff of, you know, the young person in the family goes off to university, and the father thinks he's just too good for the family anymore, and it's just a role reversal. But definitely watch that whole video. And I believe it was, let's see, I want to say about, yeah, it was about 1909 when the person, Filippo Tomasi Marinetti, who founded Futurism, he was almost run off the road by an automobile when he was riding his bicycle. I believe that that's what the story is. And it caused an epiphany where he realized that the world, or he felt that the world, the only way for it to go forward, oh no, he wasn't run off the road. Filippo was avoiding a bicyclist and drove his car off the road. And he was talking about the outdated nature of the bicycle, and that the future rested squarely on the shoulders of ideas like speed and industrialization, and an intellectually driven government that was not diluted by the emotions of people. And I think last week we were talking a little bit about, you know, when I was talking about phenomenology and its comparison with Cartesian thought, where this Enlightenment idea was that the more emotion you had in your observation of the world, the less connected you were with reality. And phenomenology said, well, no, emotion is necessary to our understanding of reality. And that's what the Cubists were really talking about. And Filippo, he wants to remove, again, all emotion from governance and other things. So we're filled with the idea that power, speed, mechanization, the way to the future is by using those tools to physically destroy the relics of the past. And I do use in this module, I do use some sarcasm that I hope people realize is sarcasm. And you know, I use the term overturning the rancid moral ethics of the past. I put rancid in quotes so you could appreciate that I'm saying that's what they thought. But you can tell futurism is based on a very, I would recommend reading that manifesto. It's really disheartening. You know, it talks about, let's kill everybody that doesn't agree with us. Let's kill everybody whose ideals are stuck in the past. Let's kill everybody who's not willing to give up their root in history. And let's kill everybody that's slowing us down. So, you know, think about this is the time period where governance, you know, a nationalistic, dehumanizing governance really started being attractive to people in Europe. I mean, the Bolsheviks were gaining power in Russia. China was setting to have a people's revolution, to be governed by principles of communism. And so, you know, the people that were approaching this were looking at communism as something that should be enforced and enforceable by law, and you destroy everybody that doesn't agree with you, and opens the doors to fascism and just the most evil of Nazism. And what's interesting to me about this is I don't think people understand where this comes from. These things began as ideas to bring the world into utopia. And there was this justification that kept emerging, which was the ends justify the means. And that is never and should never be viewed as a valid argument, because if the ends are worthwhile, everything leading up to that is also going to be worthwhile. And if the means are nasty and horrible and deplorable, they can only support the ends that are nasty, horrible, and deplorable. And it's just which is interesting to me. And I'm saying that in a broad sense. When governmental leaders say we need to kill everybody that doesn't look like us, we need to stop people from reproducing that don't look like us, we need to do these kinds of things to forcibly engender a world that is the way we want as rapidly as possible. That sets the stage for art movements that just are not really, may have some really interesting ideas to explore, but I really feel, and this is entirely Andrew Kosrock anecdotal, they're not ultimately sustainable. And there's some history behind that. When we look at like ancient Egypt, for example, the dynasties that went out of the way to deprive people that were not the same as them of rights, and to steal from those that didn't agree with them, and to take whatever they wanted, destroy the old, those dynasties did not last very long. And then you get the leaders that did everything they could to make collaborative treaties with their neighbors so that both of them could win. And those dynasties are the ones that last are the ones that last a long time. Hatshepsut is a hero of mine. She was the only woman pharaoh, as far as I understand, of Egypt. When her husband died, her son was only like 3 years old, I think. And as people were still reeling from the death of her husband, she had herself royal portraits done of her with a flat chest and a beard, and had herself declared pharaoh. And then one of the first things she did as pharaoh was say that for the pharaoh's reign, this is the only time that he will manifest as a woman. So and then you see her take off the beard, and she has breasts again for the rest of her life. And then when her, for the rest of the time period until her son was old enough to rule. And because the people that had set themselves around him to teach him were just despicable, and they only had their own interests at heart. And finally, when she was able to consolidate all her power, get her son in the right position, she had herself, she abdicated and put her support behind him as pharaoh, directed him to destroy her monuments that she had made as the only two-spirit pharaoh. And she retired for the rest of her life as a priestess, just out in nowhere. But what's interesting to me is that her collaborative treaties that she made so that everybody could benefit lasted through her son's reign, and lasted for quite a while, and made Egypt very wealthy in a short amount of time. So but you see the same cycle repeat with the Etruscans. When the Etruscans were ruling the Romans, they were way ruthless in putting down anybody or destroying anybody that wasn't like them. And as soon as the Romans were able to, they destroyed the Etruscans. And then, the Western Roman Empire fell in large part because, again, they ridiculed everybody that wasn't like them. But the Eastern Roman Empire that settled, Constantine's that settled in Turkey, at any given day, up until about 1200, you would overhear half a dozen languages in the street, and people would get along with each other. Religions would share space. Their Syrian archaeologist friend of mine was telling me about some of the work that they had done finding town centers that had a synagogue, a basilica, and a mosque all facing towards each other, and with records showing that on the high holy days of each faith, the other faiths would help support them and do the work that they didn't want to do during their Sabbaths, and which I just think is really, really fascinating. And when that started changing, that's when the Ottomans took over. But because of that, embracing the build, and embracing the collaboration, the Eastern Roman Empire lasted almost 1,000 years longer than the Western Roman Empire, which I just think, and that cycle continues to repeat. Anyway, so what I'm leading up to is that futurism sucks. It looks, there's a lot of beautiful things that you see, but as a manifesto, I just think it is not. It's not a happy manifesto, and so that's why I wanted to do, in conjunction with it, talk about Art Nouveau and some of the early architecture that really went in a very different way. So that time-wise, this was going on at the same period as Futurism, but this was outside of Italy. This was a lot of people talking to each other, like Gaudi and the Green Brothers, and a lot of other artists were kind of sharing things with each other, sharing ideas with each other. And you see that in this style of architecture and work that people were doing, there's some really interesting things going on. Yes, they embraced modern industrialization. It's the only way to get all these materials this inexpensively to put into a facade. But you can see with the designs, this is Gaudi Art Nouveau. They incorporated a lot of flowing organic ideas, to bringing in the outside or the natural world into the industrial space. So the biggest difference between Art Nouveau and this early 20th century architecture and Futurism is that Futurism tried to destroy everything that was sentimental and everything that was historical, everything that was outside of the violent industrial age. And Art Nouveau and early 20th century architecture tried to use the tools of industrialization to embrace and bring in the natural world and to bring in elements of history, which I think is really a fascinating thing. And it goes to show that, I think in part, it goes to show that the ideas that we have that we think are predestined or foregone conclusions are only foregone conclusions or predestined according to the perspective of the people that embrace them or encourage them. So here's a couple really good images of Futurism right in here, and then a discussion about it right here in 9 minutes. I definitely watch those. And there's, again, a link to Futurism Manifesto, and I have here some really interesting images of Futurism. But I want you to look at this. This is a cubist. Gene Metzinger was one of the artists that we looked at last week. And we can see how different perspectives are shown, different time periods are related. It's a way of kind of sharing discrete moments of time over time and discrete perspectives over a spectrum of perspectives, all in one image. And then with Futurism, well, let's see. Let's see how long this. Okay, this is just a couple minutes. I want to look at this, and maybe this one would be better. Let's see how long this one is. Okay, this is about 4.5 minutes. This is about 2.5 minutes. Let's go ahead and watch this one. I would like you to watch both. And I want you to look at this from keeping in mind what we saw last week in Cubism.
Hannah Levine. I work in MoMA's membership department managing the patron program. This is by Umberto Bocciani, and it is called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. The first time I saw this sculpture, I was really drawn to it, first because of its big presence in the gallery. It's cast in bronze and has this beautiful metallic shine, and all of the different edges and soft round corners and sharp spikes hit the light differently. But then when you look at it for longer, you start to see how it is a figure, a human being striding forward. Bocciani was an Italian futurist, and that was an art movement in the early 20th century that wanted to do away with everything from the past and focus on what they thought the future was going to be. Dynamism, the youth, technology, and industrialism. The futurists were really interested in movement, not just movement in one direction, but movement in all directions at once. When I'm in the gallery, I love to take the stance of the figures in the art that I'm seeing. It allows me to think more about why the artist chose this position and also just embody potential emotions that the figure is having. Although I'm not sure it's at all what Bocciani was thinking when he created this, I am reminded.
Yeah, she has some really good things to say, but I want to see if we can find an image of this. All right, here we go. Here is unique forms of continuity in space. And as you look at this, you can see in relation to her, this is a person moving. And what's fascinating about it is we can see the top of a thigh here, we can see a knee here, we can see a leg moving forward, but you also see here's echoes of the different places that leg was over a moment, over the previous moments, or over the moments that are being portrayed. Here, this trailing leg, we can see different areas where here's a forward line where maybe will be moving in just a second from now. Here's maybe the air currents that moved around it in the past. You know, some of these forms are currents, some of them are just muscle lines and reflections of where the figure has moved or where it will be very quickly. And what's interesting to me about this is, like Cubism, we are seeing several different moments layered on top of each other. But I think one of the differences is, it feels to me that Cubism is more interested about sharing what the artist is observing. You know, the artist is watching and expressing what they feel about what they're seeing. And Futurism seems to be, instead of expressing observations, it's expressing the movement itself, which I think is fascinating. I don't know, but it almost feels like to me that there's less of the artist in it, and with the intention being that the artist is almost dissolving into sharing the movement, sharing the activity, sharing the energy. So I think the difference is that Cubism is more perspective driven and Futurism is more energy driven. And that's what it seems to me to be the biggest difference.
Can I ask a quick question?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, bye.
Yeah, you can. That's fine.
What correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there like a statement somewhere in the manifesto or around it about the Nike of Salmon Thrace and how like we're not that's dead. I don't know where I read that, but I'll go back and look. But when I was looking at that sculpture for the first time, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of her. But she feels not just like she's in movement, I mean, with the wet drapery and all that stuff, but she feels like passionate, hopeful, which, like you were saying, if we're looking at, the sculpture that's futurist, it feels aggressive and domineering, and I don't know.
Well, and what's interesting to me looking through this, they're talking about a lot of things where, like the just the language used is much more violent. And as I raised my body, mud spattered and smelly, I felt the red hot poker of joy deliciously pierce my heart. That's not necessarily a very friendly um, image. And he talks about uh, different things, but I was looking at this trying to find. Yes, here we talked about is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace, where he's comparing uh, militarized technology to essentially Greco-Roman classical sculpture. And he's saying the machine gun fire is more beautiful than classical work. And it's interesting to me, these are things that these people actually bought into. This idea that existence depends on speed, power, aggressiveness, being able to destroy that which gets in the way. These kind of anarchism and fascism, destroying everybody that disagrees, destroying everybody that with a foot in dead yesterdays, and talking about how beautiful devouring smoking serpents from the factories are. It blows me away. It reads like something out of post-apocalyptic nightmare, I think, from my perspective, and perhaps I'm just too emotionally involved. But what's fascinating to me is ultimately what ended up happening is these people took the opportunity to force their perspective on the people around them. And they were very active in World War I. They were on the front lines, trying to kill everybody that disagreed with them. And this overlaps Cubism. They started about the same time as Cubism, but by 1917, the Cubists are still going strong, and all the Futurists have died. They've been killed. Which I think if you are earnestly sincere about the idea that you have to destroy in order to get your perspective heard, then it's not going to go well. It goes back to the New Testament when Peter cut off the guard's ear, and Christ healed and said, those who live by the sword die by the sword. That wasn't a pronouncement so much as just an observation. Using violence to get ahead usually attracts violence in response. So there's Severini's Armored Train. We're not going to watch this whole thing, but I do want to show you imagery of this. This is a very Cubist-like image. We have the axis target on the plane there. And it's interesting, these wheels are not practical or functional, but they express more of that kind of Cubist sensibility when you're showing lots of different moments, but at the same time. But what's interesting is that in this kind of imagery, we see this celebration of militarism. And this is the advancement of the armored train. And yeah, we have, these look like sunflowers. Well, they're not, they're bullet holes. And we see these people, this is a steel-plated armored train with artillery turret and 5 riflemen. It has lines and separated shapes. It has that kind of graphic sensibility that we see with regular Cubism, with those different moments of time and different perspectives all shared at the same time. But the focus here is on destruction. And I think it's really interesting. I do think it's a very beautiful painting. But as we look at it, and I would definitely watch this video where he kind of dissects it and talks about it. The colors that in other settings would be beautiful and pleasing here represent, you know, the hope for a future when everybody that disagrees with you is dead. Which I'm laughing ironically because I think it's pretty. It's rather negative, and I think it's fascinating. And these artists, I don't want to take away from these artists because these artists are pretty amazing, but I find it difficult to honor their perspective and motivation the same way I would Cubism, even though I don't understand completely either one. I think Cubism seems to me a way of using an artistic style to embrace multiple perspectives, and Futurism uses that same kind of style as a way to celebrate rolling over other people's perspectives. You know, it's.
Do you think there was a shock value, like kind of shock value that was feeding their egos?
Oh yeah,
Wanting
absolutely.
to shock to get that need filled? I don't know.
I really believe so, and you read some of the things that the Cubists and the Futurists both said about their own work. This was at a time period where people were really extolling the virtues of being different and new. In the Western world, like in Europe and the Americas, this was really the time of the entrepreneur. From about 1880 to about 1930 or so, the entrepreneur was really the celebrated hero of the masses. Like, you know, The Great Gatsby is Fitzgerald's hymn to the American entrepreneur. And part of that fitting into that world was this conceit that if you didn't understand art, it must have value. And that's where we have the generations of that perspective, or the genesis of that perspective. And so I think, yeah, there was something of, I think there was something of the cult of celebrity, you know, trying to shock people, trying to surprise people, trying to promote the idea of the modern being good and the historical being awful. And, you
They
know,
remind
that
me
was,
of the beat poets. I did a Ginsberg, Kerouac, those guys.
oh, Capote, and
Yeah, but like Omri Barat, like in the when you had those guys in the 60s who are like, well, we're going to write poetry that shocks, that offends you, that assaults you, that really shows you what it is to be human, that really, you know, because how can you know how to live if you're just in this stuffy white suburban world? We're going to show you what it's really, and it felt, I don't know, I see these art periods pop up where I feel like whether it's music or literature, visual arts, where they're just, I don't know, like it just ego driven. The id is just like, mommy didn't love me enough, and I'm gonna say something shocking to get your attention.
well, it's funny to me because that happens all the time, constantly. And it's hilarious to me that every time it emerges, the people that are behind it, that are driving it, think that they're the first ones or that they're the best ones. And it's hilarious to me because this is the kind of, you know, fatuous absurdity that gives rise to the conceited, ego-driven artist trope that so many people respond negatively to, and they should. But then you also get artists that feed on that and play on it specifically to get you to think behind the facade. And I'm thinking about Yves Klein and Andy Warhol are excellent examples. Both of them were Rosicrucian. Both of them were really deep thinking philosophers, but they manufactured celebrity personalities specifically to ridicule their contemporaries that actually pretended, that actually thought they were taking themselves seriously. And I think it's just absolutely hilarious. Um, yeah, Andy Goldsworthy famously said, "Why do it? Because it's easy." And then you look at, nobody knows about the Stations of the Cross paintings that he considered his life's work that were stolen and are still missing. And and Yves Klein was trying to bring people to focus on the double standard of treatment towards women, and by and he said, well, he thought to himself, well, why just relegate them to office workers? Let's go all the way. And so he used women as brushes in his paintings. And he wasn't doing that because he was a misogynistic pig. He was doing that from a Rosicrucian standpoint. You do things like that to get people to realize, oh, this is bad, and to hopefully get them to change. Andy Warhol was doing the same kind of thing when he'd celebrate icons of consumerism with the same geometry as his predecessors 500 years before were celebrating icons from the Bible. And it just. But we'll get into that later on. But I just think it's really very interesting and
throw a little Banksy in there.
What's that?
Throw a little Banksy in there.
That's something else that I think is fascinating, because Banksy, I like taking Banksy and Slinkachu together, because together they kind of form this. They ridicule their own societally self-reflective ego, and they make fun of themselves. And I think, but that's outside of the scope of this class. But I think that they do enough ridiculing of themselves and what people expect to see from them that I think it elevates them from being just entirely ego-driven, celebrity-seeking, shallow, pseudo-humorous.
Yeah, but you just because we talked about Banksy, I can now include this in one of my weekly reflections, right?
Oh, okay. All right. Just make sure that you
joking.
right at the beginning. Hey, since we talked about this.
Great.
Now, I want to share. I love seeing Art Nouveau, Expressionist architecture, and Prairie Style in conjunction with Futurism, because Futurism to me is inherently sad. And these are several examples of Art Nouveau architecture, and you can really see where people are using just the cutting edge of cement casting capability, cement reinforcing to make these very coral-like organic forms. And sometimes they look like trees. And what's fascinating, because I do work with glass, and I have for many years, a lot of this stuff, I'm looking at the kind of engineering that is necessary to create these things. People were using cutting edge industrial materials and processes to crystallize the natural world in what at the time was a modernist setting. And I think it's absolutely amazing when you can look at this and see this curving edge that is dependable, when 20 years before this would have been almost impossible to maintain. Large scale decorative glass like this, that with multiple colors, which didn't even emerge as a technical possibility until the turn of the century. And they're using this to connect with the historical and with the natural world. And I think it's absolutely beautiful to see. And I love seeing this in juxtaposition with the Futurism, because where the Futurism was bent on destruction of the old, this is spiritualizing the old. And I think it's just, from the illustrations if you guys get a chance, if anybody wants to do a report on the original illustrations for Frank Baum's Oz books, they were heavily influenced by Art Nouveau. And Alphonse Mucha actually did one of his books, Decorative Documents, is an exploration of what Ozma's hairstyle, silverware, clothing, accoutrements, all that would look like in the land of Oz. very, very cool stuff if anybody wants to do that. And then I am mentioning Expressionist architecture. This, I think, and we'll look at the Bauhaus in just briefly too. Definitely go through here. But as you look at the Expressionist architecture, what we're looking at is specifically architecture that is responding to the capabilities of contemporary materials, doing things that 10, 15, 20 years before were completely impossible, and doing things specifically to connect or to alter the form of the expected cube into something that has more pleasing shapes. You look at this, almost looks like a lighthouse, this observatory. This reminds me of something that Frank Gehry might have done. And then, of course, we have the St. Louis Arch, which was only possible because of the technological advancements of the early 20th century. This was one of the wonders of the world at the time it was constructed. And during the period of its construction, they stretched nets between as they were going up higher and higher into the sky. Lots of praying, lots of tying people off, but not a single person died during its construction, which I think it is really amazing. And this is where we see a lot of curved lines being incorporated into what would otherwise be just brick blocks of buildings. And then I do talk a little bit about Bauhaus. We don't have time to watch this. We'll talk about the Bauhaus more later on, but definitely watch this video. The Bauhaus was set up right after World War I with the idea of not doing away with the old to produce a new system of visual thinking, but to try to rationalize a way towards a beautiful new design system that would marry form and function. That's where that phrase comes from. Using the technical capabilities of the 20th century with the wisdom of design that was gained over the last 3,000 years. And so Art Deco, Art Nouveau brings back a lot of Egyptian design and Greco-Roman aesthetic. And the Bauhaus doesn't necessarily do away with that, but they try to update it using languages of mathematics and rationality. And it's really fascinating to me because Bauhaus was powerful enough using balanced geometry, using ways of making environments both flexible and utterly livable, comfortable. That was the ideal result, making a living in space comfortable and livable, but also accessible to people, using geometric shapes, using not necessarily subtle colors, using primary colors, using things that were simple that everybody could understand. Some of the first buildings were designed to be entirely modular. And this is where we get the ideas that later grew into IKEA furniture, where everything is modular. If you know the size of the space, you have a near infinite number of options because everything can fit. What's so fascinating about Bauhaus is this has informed architecture and design still. Almost every website you come to has its graphic design rooted firmly in the Bauhaus school. That was what user experience is based on today, which I think was fast. So that's 100 years of tradition that people still use. And Walter Gropius was one of the guys that really helped to do this. He encouraged students to come together, talk through things. That he was a big proponent of the idea that free speech means that you listen to respect with people that don't agree with you, whose ideas fill you with derision. You still listen with respect because they have the right to say what they say too. And he taught that the moment you deprive somebody else of their perspective is the moment you lose the right to promote your own. Which stuff like that is just amazing to me. And like Corbusier, his early stuff fits right in with these things. And then when he was in France and the Nazis started coming in the 1930s, he got to a point where he realized that for the safety of himself and his family, he had to side with the Nazis. And it's interesting because his artwork and his perspective takes a decided shift during the 30s, and a lot of people derided him for it because they felt he was no longer true to his art. But I think there's enough evidence to support the idea that he was making a concerted effort to protect himself and his family from what the Nazis were doing in France. It was just interesting. But what is fascinating to me is that even though Bauhaus was very intellectually spiritual, Le Corbusier tried to root everything on dispassionate mathematics, which is kind of funny because he was designing environments to be livable and comfortable as well. He designed a whole city in India that is still profoundly beautiful. And, it has a lot of the flowing lines that we see in the Expressionist architecture, a lot of the echoes of Art Nouveau grace, and a lot of really beautiful design work. And this video talks a little bit about that.
Have you been to the Park Güell?
What's that?
Have you been to the Park Güell? I think I'm saying that right. In Barcelona.
No.
Gaudi's, it's really cool. I did get to visit it and walk around. The community is huge, and it's all built like that. Bringing nature in, and the reinforced and like industrial idea of like living in a way that everyone can live in harmony, both inside the house and in their community. It was really cool.
Well, and I love that provides a beautiful segue into Green and Green and Frank Lloyd Wright, because the difference between Prairie Style Architecture by these guys and what Le Corbusier, Bauhaus, Expressionist architecture, Art Nouveau, the difference was not motivation, because Frank Lloyd Wright and Green, as they were building what became American Prairie Style, they were using that American what's the word for it? I want to say that the pioneering practicality of the European settlers as they adopted coming into the Americas, or North America primarily. What was really fascinating is he's taking that kind of pioneer practicality, but embracing industrialization to the point where it does allow you to bring in materials that echo natural surroundings. And where Frank Lloyd Wright was absolutely enamored of geometry and diagonal lines, particularly stylizing wisteria, rye, and wheat, because he felt that those were fundamental to an understanding of the American Midwest and the plains. He also was completely enamored of the ancient Americas. One of the most incredible civilizations that has left an echo in the Americas is the at least 2,000 year run for the Maya culture. And when Frank Lloyd Wright went to Mexico, he looked and went to I think it was, what's that peninsula that's south of Florida?
You're talking about like the Yucatan?
Yeah, Yucatan. He looked at all these ancient Maya buildings, and he was particularly enamored with the height of the Tlaloc-inspired Mayan architecture. And he brought that back with him. And he felt that it was justifiable to put that with the plains style and the pioneering practicality, because all those things were intrinsic to the Americas. And he would incorporate ideas of feathers and traditional beadwork, a lot of stuff from the indigenous Americans as well into his designs, just really building a beautiful balance of all these ideas coming together. And then Green and Green in California what was amazing about them is they took this idea in a little bit different direction. They took that pioneering practicality, but they coupled it. They were really enamored with California Art Deco in California, and so they brought in an awful lot of organic imagery, and they fused um, American arts and crafts, practical, with elements of Art Nouveau and Art Deco to create these really beautiful structures that now, this style of building is now called the California bungalow, but it has all these little things like you can see it, little knickknacks on the roof line. He used a lot of, the brothers used a lot of ginkgo leaves and Japanese maple. And so where Frank Lloyd Wright worked quite a bit with diagonals and geometry, Green and Green worked a lot with organic lines. And you can see the window cutouts here behind this the presenter, and you can see all these different flowing lines, really reminiscent of what we saw with the Art Deco. I just think stuff like that is really amazing. But you can tell from the timbre of my voice, it is a very different perspective than what we saw with Futurism, I think. We look at, here's a really good example of Futurism. This is the armored train in action from the first part of World War I. And then this is a little bit earlier than that, but a lot of their work overlapped. What Green and Green were doing, a lot of their stuff overlapped with the Futurists were doing. And I think, we can see from very similar time periods, just this feels so much more hopeful. Now, this is from 1904, and this is from 1915, but we can look at 1915, what Green and Green were doing, and that's where you see a lot of Japanese maple and ginkgo leaves, same kind of organic growth going on. And I think there might be something, I think we can make an argument that these guys are working right in the thick of World War I, where people were dying. And you're talking in California, at the opposite side of the world, people were really sheltered. But a lot of people in California went and served in World War I as well. And I do think it's really fascinating to see the difference in perspective. What do you guys think about the stuff that you've seen?
Sarah, I talk too much. You go.
I don't know, something that I just keep on thinking back on is kind of what you said at the beginning about how Futurism, I wrote it down, I'm not to find it. Oh yeah, Futurism is based on intellect and an intellectually driven government, and kind of pushing down emotion. And I feel like that is a big difference that I kind of see between Futurism versus Art Nouveau, Prairie Style, Expressionism. We've talked about is that they leave room for emotion to influence them. And then Futurism, it was very let's get rid of emotion and see what's kind of left when we have kind of this intellectually and industrialized driven mentality.
Do you think you can see that in the artwork, in the examples of artwork?
I think, especially going back to that sculpture that we looked at, that now I can't remember the name.
Forms in Space.
Yes, that one. Just something it's very, something that I noticed about it is that you can kind of see different parts of the body. But one part of the body that I was definitely not getting a lot of was the face and the head and just kind of the identity of the figure. And so I think that they really stripped that away. Whereas in Art Nouveau, for example, they really highlight the human of figures in it. and then like really going off of living things to influence other aspects of art, like even architecture, and just really focusing on life.
I think that's really a good observation. I want to, let's see. Okay. I want to share something with, we do have time. I want to share something with the Bauhaus. And this, I think, is really important. The video is about 7 minutes long. We're probably not going to watch the whole thing. But what you were talking about, I think, is the thing that really separates the Bauhaus out. And I like bringing out the Bauhaus because it brings in the intellectually driven industrialization that the futurists loved, but it couples it with emotion and the needs of the human animal. And so you get this odd thing that I think fits in, but it looks very different than any of the other things. So like I said, we are going to cover that again. We're going to look at Dada in a while, and we'll return to Bauhaus when we look at Dada. But I want to watch this video. So if you guys promise to try your best to stay awake for the next 7 minutes, then we'll watch this. But I think it ties in, Sarah, with what you were saying, since Kelly finally let you say something. Okay, here we go.
Many artists, architects, and historians, the Bauhaus is a symbol of modernism and artistic ingenuity.
Now, look at these animations here, because all these things are rooted in simple forms and simple colors that define Bauhaus. And one of the reasons why the Bauhaus was so enamored of simple forms and simple colors is that they felt that a lot of, like what Kelly was talking about people creating celebrity for themselves. The Bauhaus movers were really worried that people were finding themselves disconnected from the art scene because they assumed that all artists were trying to build their own cults of celebrity. You know, and they felt that going back to simple colors and simple shapes would help remove that kind of disjointed, disenfranchising visual vocabulary that, you know, obsequious, snot-nosed, ego-driven artists have been creating.
However, to the vast majority of people, the Bauhaus seems like a rather peculiar and short-lived German art school. Honestly, both views are accurate. Let's take a closer look at the Bauhaus in this video. If you'd like to see more design videos, be sure to give us a like and tell us which topics you want to learn about next. During its heyday, the Bauhaus was a cradle of modern design. The founder of the school was the modernist architect Walter Gropius. On the one hand, he had created an entirely new type of school with the Bauhaus, where students could be turned into masters. On the other, he helped to turn the Bauhaus into a kind of free-for-all experimental laboratory. The school always had a unique atmosphere. As Gropius's dream of a community of designers, apprentices, and craftsmen became a reality, the school grew into a kind of commune. People from different backgrounds all lived in close proximity to one another. They worked together, partied together, and shared ideas with one another. As a result, many people viewed the school as a kind of secular cult, or even sect. For example, one of the main masters of the school, Johannes Itten, had a magnetic effect on the students. His supporters were primarily concerned with physical and spiritual cleansing. They saw their path to self-knowledge and meditation. Itten believed that in order to remove the veil of the false world and see the truth, it was necessary to prepare the body with the help of vegetarianism, exercise, fasting, and enemas. At one point, the students of Itten carried out their ritualistic.
Okay, I'll just tell you right now that there are some elements of the Bauhaus that I just will not be able to be comfortable with. I'll just leave that out there. Anyway, moving on.
Body cleansing in the city fountain of Weimar, which led to conflicts with the city administration. As a result, Walter Gropius relieved him from his post in 1923, forcing him to leave the school for good. It was not the only master who acted as both an artist and a prophet. Many of the school's teachers held complex philosophical views and sometimes unwittingly bewitched their students. In addition to its philosophical and political effects, the Bauhaus was notorious for its outrageous parties. Gropius supported the idea that theater shows, lectures, poetry, music, and costume parties should all be part of the training program. In his opinion, rest and relaxation were no less important for creative thinking than work. Oskar Schlemmer, who had held the position of head of the theater workshop since 1923, offered an answer for the peculiar holidays. He believed that play was the power that made creativity possible. Schlemmer used parties as an experimental stage for his workshop. The most famous product of the workshop was a triadic ballet, where the structure of the human body was destroyed with the help of complex volumetric geometric costumes, turning a human into a puppet. The Bauhaus parties never lost their moments of madness, but when the school moved to Dessau, the parties took on an increasingly professional tone. Despite its bizarre and challenging reputation, the Bauhaus fundamentally changed the world of design, especially when it came to furniture. In the 14 years of its existence, the school students created many legendary designs. One of the most famous products created at the school was the Basel chair by Marcel Lajos Breuer. This chair was very much liked by...
What's interesting is that this chair has several different iterations, and right now at Smith's, you can get 8 different colors of the most contemporary iteration of that same chair.
Vasily Kandinsky. Decades later, when Breuer relaunched the mass production of these chairs in Italy in the 1960s, he paid tribute to the artist and renamed the chair Vasily. The most famous example of female creativity at the Bauhaus came from Mary Ann Brandt in her legendary teapot. At its core, the teapot was made to be functional. The spout prevents the drops from rolling down, while the wooden handle was heat resistant. That said, Brandt didn't forget to make it aesthetically pleasing. In fact, Brandt liked her original design so much that she made several versions of the product from different materials: toneback alloy, silver, and nickel-plated silver. Walter Gropius's dream that, as in the Middle Ages, architecture would be the final product of the synthesis of arts. At the first major Bauhaus exhibition in Weimar in 1923, a group of students, George Mucci, Gunther Steisel, Alma Seedhoff-Büscher, and Marcel Breuer, built the Haus am Horn as a reflection of a new way of life. To show the versatility of his project, Gropius even shot a promotional video about what a modernist lifestyle should look like. The main architectural project of the Bauhaus was the school building itself in Dessau, designed by Walter Gropius. It was an ode to the functionalism and machine aesthetics of the 20th century. The building also served as an advertisement for goods produced under the Bauhaus patent. Sadly, all good things must come to an end. The Bauhaus went through 3 different stages: Weimar, Dessau, and Berlin. During this time, the school had 3 directors: Walter Gropius, Hans Meyer, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. None of these phases were easy, but Rohe's years were the most difficult by far. In 1930, the school had to be temporarily closed, and the dissenters disbanded. Students protested the closure and the censure of the Nazi Party. But this only delayed the inevitable. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and in the early morning of April 11, 1933, the school was closed by the police. Those who did not have proper documentation were taken away in trucks. Despite permission from the authorities to reopen the school with some changes in August of that year, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe notified everyone that the school was permanently closing due to the difficult economic situation. Modern art and design might be completely different if not for the Bauhaus School. Even though it had a short and tumultuous history, the Bauhaus had a tremendous impact on both art and mass production in the 20th century. To this day, reflections of the Bauhaus's products and vision can be seen in products and art pieces around the world. What do you find most interesting about the story of the Bauhaus? Can you think of any other art schools that can compare to it? If so, feel free to comment below. Also, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel so
don't need to advertise for them anymore. But what is fascinating to me, do you guys, looking at that, what are some of the companies and things that we use today that you see the Bauhaus still influences? I mean, the first thing I'm thinking of is modular furniture that you see at Walmart and then heroized with IKEA.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's what is so fascinating to me about IKEA is really looked down on in Northern Europe, but in the US, it's absolutely fascinating because most people today are not familiar with the same ideas of quality as our parents were. And IKEA, I think, is really responded to positively by many Americans because the designs are accessible and they're practical, and they feel balanced. If you go in with you probably, I don't know if the school even makes the golden section rulers anymore, but you can find things like that. Golden section is basically a sheet of paper is a golden rectangle. But go in with that kind of awareness and look at the designs, and you'll see that everywhere. And the golden ratio is one of those odd things. It's a design element that human beings are hardwired to respond to automatically, and we find balance there. And I think it's partly due to because it's a reflection of our DNA strand, and it's something that is used so ubiquitously in everything around us that it's very difficult to escape the impact of the golden ratio. And when people don't pay any attention to it, the thing feels off balance. And when they do pay attention to it and go against it, it feels wrong. But IKEA, their designers work very hard to work with the Bauhaus ideals and golden ratios and things like that to find those levels of comfort that we feel at ease with. And I think that's really fascinating. I know that it was a whirlwind today, talking about the good, the bad, and things in between. Any final questions or observations about what we looked at?
I have a theory that, well, I have a working theory that every 50 years something recycles historically. So you go like Greeks, Romans, Black Death, Renaissance, and then you repeat Greeks, Romans, Black Death, Renaissance. And I don't know. There's something about hate and like you were saying, like, you know, where the impetus to create comes from, that I find fascinating and very relevant. I mean, especially today with everybody being so polarized. I just would be curious to see, like, what would the manifesto today look like? You know, what are the younger generations going to get together in a room and talk for hours with the lamp hour, oil burning, and what are they going to come up with? You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it's going to be a battery powered $1.25 halogen lamp that they picked up at Walmart rather than oil in a lamp. But
right.
yeah, and it's interesting to me because I do see these ideas recycling,
Mhm.
and there's a model of uh, critical thinking that I really appreciate. That it just is an articulation of what we all do anyway. We can't help it because we're thinking critters. That
Mhm.
is the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, where you have an idea, initial idea,
Mhm.
you experiment, you try to verify or validate that, you find something else that is in opposition to it, that you realize might also be true. And then as you fuse those two things together, that's where you're synthesizing and creating a new idea. And we see this over and over and over again. And I think schools like Bauhaus were really good at synthesizing that, the desire to connect with nature and history that Art Nouveau and ideas that sponsored like Prairie Style and stuff, that those were really good at representing, with that kind of intellectualizing aesthetics that like Hitler's favorite artist was a very humanist intellectual artist that created things that were that look on the surface very much Art Deco, but they had a lot of futurist motivation behind them. And the Bauhaus was able to kind of fuse these ideas that almost seem like opposites, and it totally makes sense that they could not coexist with Hitler's Germany. They were completely, that school was completely closed because of the Nazis and what the Nazis stood for. And it's interesting that the Bauhaus ideas still kept going, and they still keep going. People still return to them because they are things that I think represent our desire to fuse apparent opposites. And I just think that's really fascinating. How about you, Sarah? Any last observations or questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump right off of what you were saying. Like how we were talking about how futurism died because like it can't really stand if it's built just on like anger and hate, but that the Bauhaus was able to just continue. And like I'm in the design world, and so like we talk about the Bauhaus a lot, and just go back to that as kind of like the foundation of modern design. Like that's where it kind of started, and just the way that form and function, the way that those two balance now in design, just really goes back to that. And then just seeing how, trying to find more of like a middle ground ends up being able to create something that lasts for so much longer and has such a big impact.
Which ironically is not what they want, because we have consumerism and products are built to not last so that they can be replaced. And, not always, but to look at that idea of sustainability is like, it feels like the classical ideals of art. It feels like foundational, and you build to last, and you build it with beauty and care, versus something that's fragile that, I don't know. It's late. I'm waxing poetic about nothing. I'm sorry.
And I think our time is over, but I wanted to mention something, just an observation, anecdotal observation. It's interesting to me, the renaissances that happened in Europe, and I'm talking about Merovingian, Carolingian, and Italian, happened at a point and under the patronage of leaders that really wanted to establish order and peace and make the peace last. Charlemagne, he was at the beginning of his reign, he forced people to pay attention to him to get as quickly as possible to a point where people didn't have to worry about where their meals were coming from. And he is credited as creating the Europe that everybody's familiar with, because he found ways for people to get along and find that they could get along, and it would be more profitable for them to be friends than the expense of warfare and gaining power and support that way. And it's interesting to me that the Renaissance happened just a generation after the close of the Crusades. The last Crusade, people were coming home in 1296, and the Renaissance, people started bringing ideas home, and that they had come across in North Africa and the Middle East, and people were coming home who had seen the world's tallest buildings, the world's biggest structures, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, that was so big that there were cloud formations inside, and it could cover the Statue of Liberty. And that's when architects start thinking, maybe we can do something like that. And that's when Gothic architecture is born. We're building the tallest structures that Europe had ever seen. And people realizing that by collaborating and incorporating ideas and working with people, they could make a much more long-lasting, profitable future. And it's just fascinating to me. There is a lot of growth. There is a lot of invention that happens under the impetus of warfare.
Mhm.
But when people decide, you know, I want to find ways of getting along and collaborating, that's when it seems like the magical stuff really starts happening. And that's why I think it's so sad that the Bauhaus puttered out. I mean, they could not survive under a regime of hatred, but their echoes still come forward. That's what informed the American architecture in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and today still. It's informed web design. You look at your interface right now, that you know we're seeing this online. This is following the principles of Bauhaus design. I think good design lasts, and as echoes move forward, regardless of whether or not we remember any of the names that came up with those ideas. But I just think that's really fascinating. And of course, how many futurists can you name? There's not enough. You know, Boccioni and maybe a couple others, but they're all dead.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of sad. But anyway, I hope you guys have a wonderful week and weekend. I look forward, and we'll look at some of the projects next week that people are doing. I'm excited with a lot of the things that I see. And again, if you don't get all the points you want, look at what I said, ask me for clarification, and resubmit. There's no reason not to get a perfect score in this class. All right, guys? And we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Good night, guys.
Thank you.
We'll see you.